Hello. In this video, we will be continuing discussing the amendments to the United States Constitution for 11th grade U.S. history. Last time, we talked about the 18th Amendment and the positive and negative effects it had on the people in society at the time that it was ratified. Today, we'll be discussing the 19th Amendment, which prohibits any state and the federal government from denying any person the right to vote based on their gender. So using this summary, we're going to answer a quick question, which is to write down 2 reasons why this amendment was significant and or important. So go ahead and pause this video and write down your 2 reasons. So now that we have our 2 reasons, we're going to discuss 2 big important ones. With the first one being that it gave women the right to vote, something they were still unable to do up until around the mid-19th century, which was in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified. The next being that women were looking to expand their lives outside the home. They were still looked at as to be the homemakers. They were in charge of making sure the house was clean, that the kids were clean, and they were being raised properly, and that the food would be ready for when the husband came home from work. Now we're going to look at a brief timeline for the 19th Amendment. So how it began and how it got to the point when it was ratified in 1920. The beginning being at the Convention of Seneca Falls in New York in 1848, and then the end being in 1920 when it is ratified into the Constitution. So go ahead and write this down in your notebook. Make sure you keep it in your notes because we will be using this as a reference point as we go on into this lesson. So to go more into detail about the big points in this timeline, we'll start off with 1848, which was the Seneca Falls Convention, where 100 people attended the convention, 2/3 being women and the other 1/3 being men, which was a huge point in their advantage because it was going to take both men and women in order for women to gain the rights that they were looking for. So it was the start for the women's suffrage movement. It was a shaky start, but it was the start that they needed in order to begin to make the changes that they were looking for. In 1850, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who were 2 very famous women reformers, decided to form an alliance to be activists for women's rights. Elizabeth Cady was actually one of the heads for the Seneca Falls Convention, so she was already looked at as to be a leader and someone that women could look forward to hearing from and look up to as this movement continued on. And in 1869, Stanton and Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, which they used to begin to get that momentum that they were looking for, get more supporters, get more of their point out there, to get people to see that the changes that they wanted were for the better. And then Lucy Stone forms the American Women's Suffrage Association because she believed that the NWSA was racially divisive. They felt that they were more leaning towards white women's rights and not all women's rights. And then Wyoming becomes the first state to grant women the right to vote. Next, we're going to go into 1878. California State Senator Aaron Sargent introduces the Women's Suffrage Amendment to Congress, but it's kind of tossed to the side. They don't really pay much attention to it. It's not really regarded to high regards and given much importance like it should have been. Next, we're going to go into 1890 when the NWSA and the AWSA decide to form together into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The reason being that during the 1880s, they weren't getting any more support than they already had. They were kind of lacking and they were starting to diminish in importance and momentum. So when they combined together, they began to draw in more support from women activists and popular organizations. And then in 1913, Illinois becomes the first state in the East to grant women the right to vote, which was a pretty big deal because before, like I stated before, in Wyoming, they had already granted women the right to vote, but this was in the West. So when it finally happened in the East, it was a big stepping point for women and this movement that they had going on. And then also Alice Paul forms the National Women's Party and draws in younger generations of women. So with her party, what she does is throw more of rallies and things like this to get more momentum, to draw more people in, to get more attention from the public. And in 1919, after the end of World War I, the House and the Senate decide to approve the amendment and it moves forward. Into 1920, 1 year later in August, when it's finally ratified into the Constitution. Now that we've had a further look at the 19th Amendment and how it can be ratified and the whole movement that it took in order for this amendment to be added to the Constitution, we're going to answer the following questions. One being, why did it take so long for women to gain the right to vote? Pause this video and give your 2 reasons, and when we come back, we'll discuss 2 big ones. So one of the reasons are that many women were afraid to join the movement, and their lack of support from other women made the cause seem smaller or less important. Because less women wanted to actually join in the cause, less people wanted to help them continue that movement. Number 2 is that they couldn't convince any male politicians and voters to support or adopt their cause. So it wasn't until the 1900s that they really started to gain that momentum and start to convince people to join their cause and help them change the world and have them gain these rights that they were looking for. Question 2 is, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, were women given the same equal rights as men? Give an example of why or why not, and kind of look to our society to see for any clues about whether women and men still have the same equal rights or whether one still has advantage over the other. So go ahead and pause this video and write down your example, and when we come back we'll discuss 2 examples that I have written down. One is no, because women still do not receive equal pay as men. Our society is still faced with a gender gap. Even though women are doing the same jobs as men, they're still not receiving the same amount of pay. They're actually getting paid less than the men are. The second being that no, because women still lack affordable and inclusive national health care, and many medical programs women need are still not affordable to them. Now we're going to go into our project portion of this lesson. So using what we've learned from the women's suffrage movement, we're going to design our own revolution based off the following criteria that I have listed. So we have to make sure that we include the following. 1, your cause. 2, why you're supporting this cause. 3, the methods you're going to use to gain momentum and supporters. And 4, which is the most important, what your main goal is. So what is the goal of your movement? What is it that you want to accomplish at the end of this movement? So here's some examples that you can use for your project. Here's some topics: women's rights, gun control, school walkouts, Black Lives Matter, immigration, same-gender marriage. You're not limited to these. These are just some examples. You can obviously branch out and find your own. And here's some examples of the methods that you can use to gain supporters. So social media, walkouts, protests, boycotts, anything that you feel like it's going to get attention, it's going to help you get supporters. So feel free to expand. You don't have to be using these examples. You can use whichever ones you want. Make sure that you choose a cause that you're actually going to support, something that you can actually back up, because you want to make sure your passion comes forward in this project. Make sure you try to follow along the guidelines that I have listed here to ensure that you hit all the topics necessary to gain the full amount of points. So that's going to be all for today's lesson. So I hope you got a little bit more of an insight into the women's suffrage movement and the 19th Amendment. Next time we'll be discussing the 20th Amendment and the effects it had and why it's so important.